Hey guys, welcome back. Grab a blanket, get comfy, and maybe pour yourself something warm, because tonight we're stepping into the icy world of medieval winters. And trust me, people back then didn't just worry about frostbite or running out of firewood. Oh no, they were absolutely convinced that the long dark nights were filled with ghosts, witches, and omens hiding in every creak of the floorboards. Now I know you and I might roll our eyes at some of these superstitions, but imagine living in a world without central heating, without Netflix, and with wolves howling outside your door. You'd probably start believing that spilling salt or hearing an owl at night meant something serious too. Honestly, I can't blame them. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Are you listening in bed, maybe wrapped up in a blanket fort, or just trying to fall asleep after a long day? And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It keeps this little medieval storytelling tavern alive. So, are you ready? Let's see if you can make it through the strange, spooky, and surprisingly funny world of medieval winter superstitions, without shivering too much. Imagine it is the middle of a medieval winter. You've survived the harvest, salted what pork you could, stacked firewood with something resembling optimism, and now you open your hut door one morning only to be greeted by a world so quiet it makes your teeth ache. The snow has fallen thick, muffling everything, and suddenly the village seems like it's holding its breath. To us, silence after snowfall means peace, the kind of moment Instagram influencers ruin by stomping around in furry boots. To them, it was a message, and not a cheerful one. You see, in the medieval mind, the world was never random. Nothing just happened because of weather, or physics, or sheer accident. Everything was a sign. If snow covered the fields and the silence pressed on your ears, you were standing inside God's parchment. He was writing something in the frost, and you'd better learn to read it fast. Now, interpretations varied wildly depending on which monk, peasant, or ale-soaked uncle you asked. Some villagers swore the silence was God's mercy, like a white sheet covering the ugly sins of humanity. The mud, the blood, the waste, all hidden under a divine quilt. Others were less optimistic. They muttered that such silence meant demons were roaming about, the snow conveniently giving them camouflage. A muffled world was a world where evil could sneak right up to your door without a sound. So every time the snow fell thick, you can imagine poor Agnes clutching her rosary and praying that the devil wouldn't track snowy footprints into her cottage. The problem with medieval superstition is that it never gave you a neutral option. Snow never just meant snow. If it was soft and fluffy, it was God's blessing. If it was heavy and sticky, it was a sign of famine. If it was crusty and sharp, well then, clearly your sins were being counted. One medieval chronicler even suggested that snow falling without wind was proof the angels were watching closely. Which sounds poetic until you picture monks staring anxiously out of drafty abbey windows trying to decide if the flakes were descending too politely. And then there was the silence itself. Complete stillness made people deeply uncomfortable. In a world without earplugs, earbuds, or soundproofing, life was usually noisy. Chickens squawking, pigs snorting, blacksmiths hammering, drunks singing, children crying. If suddenly you could hear your own heartbeat, something was up. Some said it meant the dead were walking, their presence sucking the sound right out of the air. Others thought it was angels hovering, listening to who dared curse the weather. The bravest souls tried to joke about it. The rest sat by the fire muttering prayers while the snow piled higher. There's also the small detail that winter silence was, quite practically, dangerous. Snow muffled not only voices but warnings. Wolves padded closer, carts slid silently, and roofs groaned under weight until suddenly they collapsed. So people weren't entirely wrong to treat a silent, snowy morning as ominous. It really could kill you. The difference is that we would call it physics. They called it divine will or diabolic mischief. If a roof caved in after a storm, the explanation wasn't shoddy carpentry, but punishment for gossiping about your neighbour's turnips. The church naturally leaned into this fear, because when did priests ever waste a good opportunity to make people nervous? Sermons described white snow as the purity of Christ, urging villagers to confess their sins so they too could be washed clean. The same sermon might warn that if silence lingered too long, it was a warning of wrath. Clever move, really. Whether the silence was peaceful or eerie, the answer was always, come pray harder and maybe drop a few coins in the offering box while you're at it. But peasants, ever practical, developed their own interpretations. Some said that if snow fell so silently you could hear it landing on your cloak, it meant a good harvest was promised. Others believed that if snowflakes stuck to your eyelashes without melting, someone in the village was destined for marriage. Imagine poor Edith blinking furiously while her friends shouted congratulations, and she's just trying not to fall face first into a snowdrift. Not all the ideas were harmless, though. There are recorded tales of villagers accusing each other of witchcraft if silence lingered too long. One poor woman in France was blamed because, during a particularly quiet snowfall, her cat sneezed. That was apparently enough proof for her neighbours that she had called the devil into town. You must imagine the awkwardness of that trial. How do you plead to the charge of suspicious feline sneezing? Medieval logic was never at its best in winter. Another curious belief was that the silence of snow could trap souls. Yes, trap them. The flakes falling without sound were thought to catch the voices of the dead, freezing their whispers so they couldn't reach the living. Some mourners even ventured out in storms, pressing their ears to snowbanks in hopes of hearing loved ones trapped inside. Which sounds romantic until you realize they were basically pressing their faces into frozen manure heaps because medieval villages weren't exactly sanitary. Let's not forget travel. Silence meant danger for those on the road. Merchants who found themselves surrounded by muffled whiteness claimed it was a bad omen, that thieves or worse would strike before they reached the next town. Pilgrims worried silence was a trick of the devil, luring them into snowdrifts where they would freeze. So, naturally, charms and prayers were invented. A traveller might carry bread in his pouch, not for eating, but to throw into the snow to distract spirits, which probably just ended up feeding crows, who must have been delighted with medieval superstition. Of course, not everyone trembled. Some of the more cynical chroniclers mocked their neighbours, noting that if snow meant blessing in one town and curse in the next, then clearly somebody was guessing wrong. But even they admitted there was something uncanny about stepping outside to hear nothing. No wind, no birds, no chatter, just the crunch of your own boots. In a world already thick with fear of devils, plagues, and taxes, you can forgive people for thinking the silence carried weight. And let us not forget the storytellers, always eager to turn weather into legend. Bards spun tales of silent snowfalls as the cloak of fairies, descending to dance unseen in the fields. Others warned children that if they spoke too loudly during a silent snow, frost demons would mark their breath and follow them home. Parents no doubt used this to buy themselves some peace. Imagine finally silencing your brood by whispering, "Hush, or the frost demons will hear you." Effective, if a bit traumatizing. The funny thing is, despite all this superstition, life carried on. People trudged out to chop wood, hauled water, tended animals, and tried not to slip on icy paths. Yet in their hearts, the silence still nagged. It was the medieval equivalent of getting an ominous text message with no context. You know it means something, but what? Snow's hush was an empty envelope delivered by nature, and everyone argued about what the message inside said. And perhaps that is why silence in snow kept such a grip on them. In a world of constant noise, silence was rare. It pressed on the imagination. Was it divine, demonic, a forecast, or simply a moment of stillness begging them to notice? Whatever the case, medieval people never walked out into that hushed world without glancing nervously at the sky, clutching their charms, and wondering whether tomorrow would bring feast or famine. And though we may laugh at their fears, admit it, the next time you step outside into a world of snowy silence, you might just feel that twinge too. The sense that something is listening, waiting, just out of sight. Picture a medieval winter evening. The snow outside is knee-deep, the wind whistling like a drunk minstrel with a broken flute. And inside the longhouse or peasant cottage, everyone huddles around the hearth. The fire isn't just for warmth, it is the medieval television, the medieval therapist, and the medieval prophet rolled into one. The flames leap and crackle, sparks dance upward, and people stare into them, not simply because they are mesmerizing, but because they are convinced that the fire is whispering secrets. And unlike modern horoscopes that tell you vague nonsense, like, you may meet someone interesting today, fire omens were much more direct. They told you if you were about to die, get married, or possibly both. The logic went like this. Fire is alive, it breathes, it eats, and it moves. If it is alive, surely it must also know things. This is what medieval reasoning looked like after several mugs of ale and a sermon about the mysteries of creation. So sparks flying from a log weren't random. They were messengers. A shower of sparks meant someone in the household would soon marry. Cue the awkward glances across the room. If you were a young man and sparks flew, everyone suddenly stared at you like you were about to announce your engagement on the spot. If you were an older widow and sparks leapt up, people coughed nervously and changed the subject. A single pop from the fire, however, was a different matter. That sharp crack of wood splitting could make the room go dead quiet. A pop was bad. It meant death was on the way, perhaps in the village, perhaps closer. Imagine the tension of spending winter nights listening for the fire to betray you. Every snap of a log became a drumbeat of doom. Children were hushed, conversations cut short, and some folks muttered prayers as if to argue with the fire's grim forecast. Sometimes the wood just popped because it was wet. But try convincing a villager of that when they're already picturing their coffin. If a log split and fell apart in the hearth, that too was ominous. A broken log symbolized broken health, broken fortunes, or even broken families. One chronicler noted that a collapsing log meant, "A soul shall depart this place ere long," which is rather poetic for what was probably just poorly chopped timber. But poetry is no comfort when your only source of heat is also whispering death at you while you try to roast a turnip. The fire also spoke in patterns of smoke. Smoke blowing into the room instead of up the chimney could mean that spirits were visiting. This was inconvenient, not least because it filled your hut with choking fumes, but also because nobody wanted to anger the unseen guests. People would open doors or windows briefly, muttering apologies to whatever ancestor was presumed to be dropping by. Of course, the neighbor with basic carpentry knowledge would mutter that you simply needed to clean your chimney, but in winter, superstition always won over science. There was also the matter of embers. Glowing embers could form shapes, and villagers swore they saw letters, faces, even entire scenes. A glowing ember shaped like a ring meant a wedding was near. An ember shaped like a shroud meant a funeral. To us, this sounds like medieval cloud watching, but when you live in a one-room house and your entertainment is either staring at the fire or listening to Cousin Bernard recite psalms for the 50th time, you start seeing whatever drama you crave in the flames. Children were warned never to poke the fire carelessly because that was seen as inviting bad luck. If a child jabbed a stick into the embers and sparks shot out, it meant misfortune would follow them. So naturally, children being children, they poked the fire every chance they got, just to see the adults panic. One can imagine the delight of a mischievous 8-year-old cackling as his mother gasped, "That spark means you'll never marry Thomas." Poor Thomas, cursed not by fate, but by his own sense of fun. At times, fire omens were oddly specific. In some places, it was believed that if sparks clung to your clothes and didn't burn holes, you'd soon come into money, which makes you wonder how many people tried rolling around in front of the hearth hoping to retire early. Another superstition claimed that if the flames roared louder than usual, unexpected guests were coming. Perhaps that's where the idea of a warm welcome began. Though medieval hosts were less thrilled about it since guests meant feeding yet another mouth from already scarce winter supplies. And then there was the ultimate terror, when the fire suddenly went out on its own. No gust of wind, no meddling children, just flames vanishing. This was seen as the surest sign of doom. Death was imminent, or the devil himself had passed by. In truth, the log probably rolled into a heap of ash and smothered itself, but try telling that to a roomful of medieval villagers already glancing nervously at each other. Some would rush to relight it with holy words, others would insist that it was too late, and a few might start packing to move in with relatives 3 towns away. Interestingly, monasteries had their own fire superstitions, though cloaked in theology. Monks sometimes read divine signs in how steadily the flames burned during vigils. A bright, unwavering flame meant God's favor. A guttering one meant sin in the ranks. Imagine the poor novice responsible for stoking the fire, sweating bullets as the abbot glared at him whenever the flames flickered. "Brother Matthew, your soul seems to be smoking again." Not all was doom and gloom though. The fire could also promise good fortune. A sudden flurry of sparks was seen as blessings raining down, each spark a symbol of coming joy. If sparks flew to the east side of the room, a wedding was near. If to the west, a birth. To the north, expect visitors. To the south, expect trouble. Conveniently, there were always 4 directions, so the fire was never wrong. Whatever happened next, someone could point to the hearth and say, "See, the fire foretold it." Naturally, the church tried to stamp out some of this nonsense, warning against divination, but old habits die hard, especially ones that come with free light and heat. Besides, the priests themselves sometimes gave in. A bishop might thunder against pagan superstition by day, and then nervously cross himself at night when a log cracked ominously. Better safe than sorry, after all. And here is where the humour of it all shines through. Picture a family, huddled together, trying to keep warm. Sparks leap, and someone immediately whispers, "A wedding!" The teenage daughter groans while her brothers snicker. Then a loud pop echoes and everyone gasps, clutching their beads. The father insists it's just wet wood, but his wife already looks like she's picking out funeral shrouds. The children, meanwhile, poke the embers when no one's watching, just to watch everyone panic again. This is winter entertainment, medieval style. Fear, gossip, and the occasional hope for a wedding feast. At its heart, fireside divination was simply a way to impose meaning on the long, dark nights. Winter was terrifying, food ran low, sickness spread, wolves prowled. The fire gave both warmth and narrative. Instead of admitting they were powerless against nature, people told themselves the flames were speaking, offering hints about what tomorrow might bring. Even if the omens were terrifying, at least they weren't silence. And when the snow pressed down outside and the night stretched endless, a crackling hearth telling stories was far better than the dreadful unknown. So the next time you sit by a fire and hear it snap, imagine a room full of medieval villagers going pale. Imagine them leaning forward, debating whether the spark meant marriage or death, and imagine the relief when the flames burned steady again. It's easy for us to laugh, but admit it. Even now, if the fire suddenly went out on its own, you'd feel a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Medieval superstition may sound ridiculous, but it lives on in that uneasy glance we still give the dark when the lights flicker, or in the way we still stare at flames, mesmerized as if their whispering secrets meant only for us. Imagine trudging through a medieval village in winter, the kind of morning where the snow lies heavy and the world looks like a baker went mad with flour. You pull your cloak tighter, muttering about frozen toes, and then you see it. Footprints in the snow that do not belong to any man, woman, or pig you recognize. And suddenly your morning walk to the pigsty turns into a theological crisis. Because in medieval Europe, strange footprints were not dismissed as funny-looking tracks. They were read as cosmic text. Each mark pressed into the snow was a letter written by something that probably wanted to kill you, steal your soul, or at least sour your ale. The human mind, left too long in the cold, will imagine anything. A rabbit hopping across your yard leaves a set of spaced-out prints, perfectly normal to us. To them, however, it could be a witch flying by night and landing briefly to sniff your cabbages. If the prints were large and clawed, clearly the devil had stopped in for a visit, possibly to check whether your family was behind on church tithes. People genuinely scanned the ground like detectives in a bad play, convinced that whatever lay beyond those prints was supernatural and deeply invested in their lives. It was never just a fox. It was always a fox possessed by demons. One of the most popular omens was the discovery of cloven hoof prints. Everyone knew what pig or goat tracks looked like, but when they appeared suddenly in the middle of the road, leading nowhere, panic spread faster than the winter chill. Some villagers swore they had seen cloven tracks appear overnight across miles, the devil pacing the countryside, leaving proof of his tour. Entire sermons were preached about these infernal wanderings, while the more practical folk suggested that perhaps a goat had simply gone walkabout. But practicality rarely wins against a good scare. People stared at the tracks until their noses froze, muttering about damnation. Cats provided another endless source of suspicion. Their paw prints in snow are light and strange, and sometimes they seem to vanish abruptly. This, to a medieval villager, was irrefutable proof that cats were witches' familiars slipping between worlds. Never mind that cats often jump onto fences or walls, leaving their tracks cut short. To the medieval imagination, those disappearing paw prints meant sorcery, and if a black cat left them, well then, congratulations. Your entire household was cursed until further notice. Better prepare the holy water. Children, of course, turned footprints into games. They dared each other to step into mysterious tracks, shouting that whoever fit their boot inside a devil's mark would be carried away by night. Naturally, someone always did it, and naturally, nothing happened. But by the time supper was eaten, rumors had spread that young Martin was probably not going to see the sunrise. Imagine the anxiety poor Martin's mother endured, glaring at the fire all evening, convinced her son had signed a contract with Satan simply by stepping where a badger had once walked. In monasteries, even learned monks weren't immune. Records survive of abbots fretting over mysterious prints in cloister gardens. Some claimed angels left them, testing the brothers' vigilance. Others insisted demons crept in disguised as animals. One poor novice was nearly expelled when his abbot accused him of turning into a wolf at night because his snow tracks looked suspiciously large. The novice insisted he simply had big boots, but once suspicion took root, logic had no chance. For weeks the poor lad was watched at night to see if he sprouted fur. Hunters, naturally, knew the tracks of beasts better than anyone, but even they succumbed to folklore when the cold nights stretched long. A bear track half filled with snow could look enormous, and suddenly the whole village believed giants had come down from the mountains. A wolf track with odd spacing might be blamed on werewolves. Hunters themselves would sometimes encourage these stories, partly for entertainment and partly to justify why they hadn't caught anything. After all, how can you blame a man for failing to bring back meat when he spent all day dodging demons disguised as deer? Perhaps the strangest stories come from the years when people swore entire armies of spirits had passed through the snow. Villagers would wake to find long, straight lines of prints crossing fields and vanishing into the woods. Explanations varied: ghosts marching, witches holding midnight processions, or even the wild hunt tearing through unseen. In truth, these were often just migrating animals, but the human imagination saw legions of the damned stomping through. And when you're half-starved, freezing, and living in a hut that leaks more than it shelters, such stories stick. They make the cold seem alive, malevolent, watching. What's delightful, in a morbid way, is how often people accused each other using footprints as evidence. If a neighbor's tracks led past your barn on the same night your cow mysteriously sickened, clearly she was a witch. If hoofprints appeared near the church, somebody must have invited Satan in. Trials were held where footprints in the snow were presented as hard evidence, which would make any modern judge choke on his gavel. But in a world desperate for explanations, a mark in snow was as good as a signed confession. The terror of footprints wasn't only about what made them, it was also about where they went. Prints that circled your house without entering were thought to be spirits testing your defenses. If they ended suddenly, it meant the creature had vanished into thin air. People even sprinkled holy water on the ground to erase such tracks, as if cleansing the very earth. Some families refused to leave their homes until fresh snow covered ominous prints, believing only then were they safe. Imagine being trapped indoors because a rabbit had walked past your door and left an oddly shaped trail. And of course, storytellers thrived on this paranoia. Tales of demons dancing in snow, witches leaving no prints at all, or the devil stamping his foot in anger became winter entertainment. Children shivered while old grandmothers spun yarns about footprints that led to nowhere, footprints that ended at doorsteps, footprints that echoed with screams at night. Whether anyone truly believed every tale is debatable, but it filled the long nights and gave people something to blame for their fear. Because really, isn't it easier to say the devil walked by than to admit the dark is just frightening on its own? So the next time you see an odd trail in snow, be grateful you don't live in a medieval village. You'll probably shrug and say, fox. But had you been born centuries earlier, you'd be standing frozen, clutching your cloak, eyes darting about while your neighbor whispered that the devil had taken a stroll. And perhaps you'd hurry home, bar the door, and sit by the fire listening for footsteps outside, wondering if the strange prints were finished with their walk, or if they were circling back toward you. Picture yourself in a medieval village at night, the kind where the only light comes from a guttering torch and the moon when it can be bothered to appear. Snow lies thick, roofs creak under the weight, and the cold has a way of reaching through every layer of wool you own. You huddle by the hearth, praying your last log lasts until morning, and then it happens. The long drawn-out howl of a wolf carrying across the frozen fields. Today, you might smile and think of documentaries, maybe even find it romantic. Back then, it was enough to make grown men whimper like frightened children, because to medieval ears, a wolf howling in the night was not nature, it was prophecy. Wolves were already terrifying enough in daylight. They prowled the forests, snatched livestock, and occasionally reminded humans that they were not, in fact, top of the food chain. But at night in winter, their howls became more than sound. They were omens. If the howl came from the east, it foretold sickness. From the west, famine. From the north, war. From the south, death in the village. Conveniently, there are only 4 directions, so whichever disaster arrived next, the wolf had called it. Villagers listened with wide eyes, pointing to the horizon and whispering predictions like amateur meteorologists of doom. The church naturally lent its own flavor of fear. Priests warned that wolves were not just beasts, but servants of the devil. Their howls were said to be demonic laughter, mocking the faithful. Some even claimed wolves howled to call wandering souls out of their bodies, dragging them to hell. Imagine the terror of lying awake, listening to a wolf sing its lonely tune, while wondering if your soul might slip free like steam from a pot and trot obediently into the woods. Sleep was a rare luxury on such nights. Hunters, who ought to have known better, added their own tales. They claimed wolves howled as warnings to each other, yes, but also as spells. A pack's chorus was said to hex cattle, freezing them with fear until they collapsed. Shepherds repeated this with grim seriousness, as though wolves had discovered a medieval form of sonic warfare. Others believed wolves howled to summon storms. A cold wind rising after a howl was not coincidence, but proof of their weather witchery. If a blizzard followed, well, clearly the beasts had friends among the frost demons. Of course, the imagination never stopped at wolves. A howl in the night might not be a wolf at all, said some, but a werewolf, and that was far worse. Werewolves were thought to roam, especially in winter, when hunger gnawed at both man and beast. A strange cry, carried by the wind, could be explained as an unfortunate neighbor cursed to prowl the woods on 4 legs. Villagers suspected bachelors most often, because apparently living alone with no wife to scold you was suspicious enough to count as sorcery. Better keep an eye on the shepherd who never married and whose dogs barked at nothing in the dark. Superstitions spread quickly. A wolf howled on the night before a raid, proof that the beasts predicted war. A wolf howled, and 3 days later, the miller fell ill. Clearly, the sound carried sickness. Confirmation bias thrived in the medieval mind. People remembered every coincidence that supported their fear and forgot the countless nights when wolves howled and nothing happened. That selective memory turned every winter howl into a headline from the supernatural news. Children were tormented with warnings that if they howled back at wolves, their souls would be stolen. Some bold boys tried it anyway, and when nothing happened, they strutted about like heroes. But then, if they caught a fever later, parents would sigh and say, "Ah, you shouldn't have mocked the wolves." The poor child could never win. Either he cowered in silence, or he became living proof of superstition. Monks, cloistered behind abbey walls, were not immune to such fears. Chronicles mention holy brothers waking in the night to howls that chilled their prayers. Some declared wolves heralded divine punishment, their voices carrying messages from God's darker servants. Others scribbled notes about werewolves haunting the woods, even naming suspected villagers who walked by day as men, but by night as beasts. The poor named souls probably just had hairy shoulders and bad luck. What's particularly entertaining is how villagers tried to ward off the sound. Some banged pots and pans, believing noise drove the omens away. Others threw salt on the fire, as if seasoning the flames could keep wolves and demons at bay. A few carried iron knives to bed, convinced the metal's weight would pin their souls inside their bodies, so the howls couldn't steal them. There is a certain logic to sleeping with a knife, though admittedly the dangers of rolling over on it outweighed the risks of ghostly lupine soul thieves. In some places, people swore that if you counted the howls in a single night, the number foretold how many would die that year. Naturally, nobody ever agreed on the count. Was that 3 howls or 4? Did you count the echo? And yet somehow, the prediction always matched whatever misfortunes followed, because who is going to argue with fate when it's already freezing outside and the wolves are still singing? Storytellers had a field day, of course. They spun tales of kings warned by wolves before assassinations, of maidens hearing their names whispered in the cries, of whole villages cursed when the chorus rose too loud. These tales were retold by firelight, each one grander and darker than the last, until children sat wide-eyed and adults shifted uncomfortably, listening for distant cries beyond the door. And once a real howl pierced the night, the whole room stiffened, the story suddenly too close for comfort. It's easy for us to laugh, but picture the setting properly. A winter night, utterly black, with only sparks for light, hunger gnawing in your belly, The knowledge that wolves really did lurk beyond the fields, capable of dragging off a sheep, maybe even a child. Then the long, mournful cry across the snow. You don't have science textbooks or nature documentaries to explain it away. What you have is a head full of sermons about sin and demons, and a heart that beats faster with every echo. Suddenly, superstition feels less like ignorance and more like survival instinct dressed in poetry. So when we hear wolves howling now and think it beautiful, perhaps it's because we listen from behind glass, bellies full, wolves far away. But in medieval nights, every howl was a warning, a prophecy, a song of dread that tightened cloaks and quickened prayers. And though we may laugh, admit it. If you were alone in the snow with nothing but a torch and the darkness pressing close, the sound of wolves rising in unison might make you pray too, whispering to whatever power listened that the night would end, that dawn would come, and that the wolves were only beasts and not omens of everything terrible waiting just beyond the trees. The hearth was the beating heart of any medieval home, especially in winter. Imagine a drafty cottage with snow pressing at the shutters, the wind howling through every gap like an impatient ghost, and the only thing standing between you and frostbite is a stubborn little fire sputtering in the hearth. Naturally, people piled every hope, fear, and superstition onto those flames. The fire wasn't just heat, it was guardian, oracle, and sometimes scapegoat. And oh, the things they believed. For starters, sparks were not just sparks. If a log cracked loudly and threw sparks into the room, this wasn't a sign that your wood was damp. It was a message from the unseen. 1 crack meant visitors were coming. 2 cracks meant money on the way. 3 cracks, though, trouble. Never mind that your firewood had probably been stacked under a leaking roof. Clearly the cosmos was trying to chat via kindling. Some families even kept tally marks of spark counts, turning evenings into a kind of flaming fortune-telling session. Picture everyone staring grimly at the hearth, waiting for wood to explode like prophets at a raffle. Then there was the colour of the flame. Blue fire, ghosts about, yellow and steady, peace for the household, too much smoke, a neighbour was cursing you. People could interpret every wisp and flicker until the fire became less a source of heat and more a needy toddler constantly demanding interpretation. If flames leaned toward the door, it meant a guest was coming. If they leaned toward the window, bad weather brewed. Honestly, it's a miracle anyone managed to relax by the fire at all. Ashes, too, played their part. Sweep them out the wrong way, and you might sweep out your luck with them. Some insisted ashes must always be left in a neat pile, lest spirits wander in to scold you for housekeeping. Others swore that stirring the ashes at midnight allowed you to glimpse faces of the dead. Not comforting faces either, mind you, but grim reminders that death was waiting outside with the snow. Imagine poking around with a stick and suddenly deciding you'd glimpsed Aunt Hilda frowning back at you. That's one way to ruin your sleep. And then came the charms. Families tossed salt into the fire to ward off witches, sending the flames into fits of snapping sparks that supposedly drove away evil. Bread crusts tossed into the blaze guaranteed another loaf on the table. Some even dripped a little ale into the flames, a toast to the spirits lurking in the corners. Yes, people willingly wasted beer in the name of superstition, evidence, if ever there was, that fear outranks thirst. Children weren't safe from all this either. Parents warned them never to poke the fire with iron at night, because it would anger household spirits. Never put wet wood on, or you'd invite tears into the home. And if you dared to spit into the flames, well, your tongue might shrivel by morning, which is quite the threat, though probably effective for discouraging the less charming habit of gobbing into the hearth. Some superstitions were surprisingly practical. A fire kept smouldering all night was thought to guard against evil spirits. But of course, a fire smouldering all night also prevented everyone from freezing solid. The line between practicality and magic was thin. Likewise, stacking logs carefully in a crisscross fashion wasn't just good airflow, it was symbolic, forming a warding cross that no witch could cross. Whether it kept witches out or just kept the fire from smoking everyone like bacon, the result was the same. People lived another day. Monks and scholars naturally found ways to complicate things further. Some claimed the fire symbolized the soul, and how it burned reflected God's favor. A lively flame meant virtue. A struggling flame meant sin. So picture some poor peasant throwing wet sticks on his fire, only to be told that his hearth's bad mood meant he needed confession. It's difficult to imagine a more stressful form of interior decoration. Storytellers made merry with the theme as well. Tales spread of witches who crept in down the chimney, only to be thwarted by families who kept iron tongs crossed on the hearth. Others told of fire spirits, sprites that lived in the blaze and reported on households to higher powers. Children were warned that if they whispered secrets too close to the flames, the fire spirits would carry their words straight to the devil, or worse, to the village gossip, which in practice was nearly the same. The hearth also became a stage for rituals. On certain feast days, families cast herbs into the fire, rosemary for protection, sage for health, bay leaves for luck. The smoke rose like an offering, drifting up to whatever gods or saints might be listening. In this way, every hearth became both altar and kitchen, blending religion and superstition until the smell of stew was mixed with the scent of sacred herbs. You ate dinner and you warded off evil. 2 birds, 1 boiling pot. Of course, some beliefs bordered on comedy. One superstition held that if a fire refused to light, it was because someone had cursed your woodpile. The solution? Steal a brand from a neighbor's fire without asking. Naturally, this encouraged sneaky midnight visits where villagers crept about stealing embers, which in turn created more curses and neighborly feuds. Nothing warms a community quite like accusing each other of hexing the firewood. Even the act of blowing on embers had layers of meaning. Blow gently, and you might coax the spirits to favor you. Blow too hard, and you risked angering them. Cough while you blew, and people muttered about bad omens. So much anxiety swirled around this simple act that one wonders how anyone lit a fire without collapsing from nerves. In the end, the hearth was more than survival. It was a theatre of superstition where every crackle and flicker carried weight. When you depend so utterly on fire, you give it personality, agency, even morality. It becomes a family member, temperamental, bossy, always hinting at mysteries. And in the long winters of medieval Europe, when the nights dragged on endlessly, that fire became a conversation partner too. Was it warning you of death, promising good fortune, or just coughing smoke because you never learned to stack wood properly? So next time you sit by a fire and watch sparks dance up the chimney, be grateful you can do so without worrying that your neighbor cursed your logs or that the devil is listening in the crackles. And maybe, just for fun, toss a pinch of salt on the flames. If nothing else, you'll have recreated a little medieval charm, and you can laugh knowing you did it in the comfort of central heating, with no witches waiting in the snow outside your door. Picture yourself trudging home after a long day of trying not to freeze solid, your boots caked with snow, your stomach growling louder than the village dogs. You push open the creaky wooden door, stomp the ice from your feet, and there on the rough-hewn table lies the true guardian of the household. A loaf of bread and a lump of salt. Forget knights in shining armor. This was medieval home security. Bread and salt weren't just food. They were talismans against every evil spirit, witch, and wandering demon with a grudge. You could say bread and salt did double duty as dinner and divine insurance policy. Now, bread wasn't just bread. It was life itself, baked in smoky ovens or on flat stones carried in baskets like holy relics. And salt, precious and often expensive, was a mineral miracle that preserved meat, seasoned broth, and more importantly, blocked evil like some sort of medieval force field. Together, bread and salt became the Batman and Robin of winter superstition. Place them on your threshold, and no spirit dared cross. At least, that was the hope. Imagine a chilly January evening, snow piling high outside, and you carefully setting out a chunk of bread and pinch of salt, muttering, "Not tonight, witches, not tonight." The act had layers of symbolism. Bread represented Christ, the body divine, while salt represented purity and incorruptibility. Combine them, and you had a snack that was also a sermon. But villagers weren't theologians, they were practical folk who believed in whatever worked. If the cow stopped producing milk, clearly a witch had passed by. Solution: put bread and salt under her trough and watch the milk return. If your baby cried too much, lay bread beneath the cradle and sprinkle a little salt nearby. The child would calm, or at least the parents would feel calmer, which in the end amounts to the same thing. Hospitality rituals grew out of these beliefs too. Offering bread and salt to a guest wasn't just a warm welcome, it was a magical pact. You were saying, "I acknowledge you as friend, and in return, you bring no harm here." To refuse the offering was downright suspicious. Only someone with something to hide, say, glowing red eyes and a fondness for goat stealing, would dare turn up their nose at such a gift. Bread and salt were edible lie detectors and social glue wrapped in crust and crystals. But naturally, the charms could be twisted. Drop your bread face down in the ashes, bad luck. Spill your salt, Disaster. The tiniest mishap became a cosmic sign. Salt scattered on the floor invited quarrels, so people scrambled to toss a pinch over their left shoulder to blind lurking devils. Bread burned in the oven? A death foretold. People stared at their loaves with the same paranoia modern folk reserve for smoke alarms, hoping the crack in the crust didn't spell catastrophe. Children were loaded with rules. Never waste bread, or spirits would visit in the night. Never lick salt off the table, or your teeth would rot as punishment from unseen forces. Always kiss dropped bread before eating it, lest you offend the saints. It's easy to see how meals became less about nourishment and more about delicate negotiations with fate. Dinner wasn't dinner, it was an exorcism disguised as supper. And then there were the livestock protections. Farmers sprinkled salt in the barn and tucked bread under the doors to guard animals against the evil eye. Some even baked bread with herbs inside and fed it to cows, believing it strengthened both beast and milk against sorcery. Goats, notoriously troublesome in folklore, were often given bread blessed at Candlemas, as though a holy snack might convince them to behave. Whether the animals noticed or not is doubtful, but the farmers certainly slept easier. Neighbours used bread and salt in more pointed ways too. Quarrelling families might refuse to share them, a silent but heavy insult. To deny someone bread and salt was to cast them out of the circle of safety, almost branding them as an enemy. On the flip side, making peace often involved breaking bread together, literally. Picture two feuding farmers, glowering across a table, finally chewing the same crust as a truce. All because bread and salt carried more authority than the local constable. In churches, bread and salt sometimes appeared at blessings. Priests sprinkled salt in holy water, doubling its defensive punch, and bread blessed on feast days was carried home like a fiery shield against illness. Families might save crumbs all year, tossing them into fires when storms raged, confident that holy bread soothed even the angriest skies. It wasn't theology so much as survival. Every tool at hand pressed into service against the cold and the unknown. Stories, of course, took these customs and embroidered them. Tales of witches shrieking when they stepped onto salted thresholds, demons gnashing teeth at the sight of blessed bread, or wandering spirits pausing hungrily but unable to enter because bread and salt wards held strong. Children listened wide-eyed, clutching crusts like talismans, nibbling them slowly as though chewing might transfer the magic inside. In this way, superstition became edible storytelling, and every meal a reminder of invisible dangers. What's remarkable is how universal the pairing became. From peasants in smoky huts to lords in drafty castles, bread and salt sat on tables as both sustenance and spell. Rich or poor, everyone feared the same winter shadows, and everyone trusted the same humble allies. In a world of knights, kings, and grand cathedrals, it was often a crust of bread and a pinch of salt that truly held the darkness back, or at least convinced people it did. So next time you sprinkle salt on your fries or tear into a loaf, pause for a moment. Imagine doing so not as a snack, but as a sacred ritual to ward off witches lurking in the snow. You'll be reenacting a superstition that once kept whole villages sane through endless winters. Bread and salt may seem simple, but in the medieval imagination, they were the twin anchors of survival, turning every meal into a fortress against fear. Imagine the medieval chimney, a soot-blackened throat leading straight from your hearth to the cold, dark sky. Today, we look at chimneys as harmless architectural features, occasionally cursed when they belch smoke back into the living room. But in the medieval imagination, a chimney was a portal. It was not merely where the fire breathed, it was a gaping hole through which witches, spirits, and the devil himself could crawl. In winter especially, when nights stretched long and the wind moaned down the flue, chimneys were less practical feature and more supernatural security risk. Villagers eyed them the way you might eye an unlocked window in a dodgy neighborhood. Witches were the primary concern. Everyone knew they traveled by night, and the chimney was the easiest entry. Doors were barred, windows shuttered, but chimneys wide open. And so people devised charms. Iron tongs crossed on the hearth kept witches from descending. Holly branches stuck into chimney corners acted as spiky deterrents like medieval barbed wire. In some places, families scattered salt into the fire each night, the smoke carrying its purifying power upward, building a kind of spiritual smoke screen that made witches sneeze and think better of visiting. Chimneys became battlegrounds where wood smoke and witchcraft collided. But witches weren't the only intruders. Chimneys also served as highways for spirits. A sudden gust blowing soot into the room might be interpreted as the sigh of a ghost arriving uninvited. Sparks leaping up the flue, a sign that demons were climbing. Families watched their chimneys as closely as their doors, listening for unnatural noises. If the wind howled too strangely, some muttered that souls of the damned were shrieking as they tried to force their way inside. Of course, in reality, it was just air currents and bad masonry. But tell that to a family shivering on a January night while Grandpa swore he heard Satan clearing his throat above the hearth. The devil himself was often linked to chimneys. Some stories claimed he tested households by peering down, his red eyes glowing in the soot. Others swore he occasionally dropped embers into the fire as a warning. Parents warned children never to look up the flue lest they lock eyes with Old Nick. A sooty face might not just mean you'd been poking about too close to the hearth. It could mean you'd glimpsed the infernal landlord checking his tenants. Children took these warnings seriously, though a few undoubtedly peeked just to see what would happen, later screaming convincingly enough to keep the story alive. Practical fireside mishaps were quickly folded into superstition. If a bird fell into the chimney and fluttered into the house, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a harbinger of death. If smoke refused to rise properly, it meant someone in the household had been cursed. Even chimney sweeps, rare though they were in smaller villages, carried a kind of eerie reputation. Crawling into those dark shafts, returning black as coal, they seemed half man, half demon, and were treated with wary respect. Few jobs blurred the line between practical labor and supernatural suspicion quite like climbing into the devil's doorway armed with a brush. During festivals, chimneys became part of ritual protections. At Christmas, families sometimes dropped blessed herbs into the fire, sending smoke to fill the chimney with holiness. On certain saints' days, bread crusts were burned, their ashes believed to seal the flue against dark visitors. Some households even carved protective symbols into the wooden beams near the fireplace, marking the entrance as guarded. Imagine sitting around the fire while smoke curled upward through those carved wards, everyone comforted that their supernatural alarm system was in place. Stories spread of witches who tried the chimney route only to be repelled. Tales told of claw marks left in soot where demons tried and failed to descend. Children were regaled with thrilling accounts of fiery spirits trapped halfway, their screams echoing until morning. These stories not only entertained but reassured. Yes, the chimney was dangerous, but if you followed the right rituals, you could keep the darkness out. In a world where winter already brought hunger and death, having control over one portal mattered. Interestingly, hospitality was also linked to chimneys. Some villages believed that smoke rising freely showed the house was blessed and safe for travelers. A smoking chimney was a beacon, promising warmth and honesty within. Conversely, a chimney without smoke on a freezing night suggested something was wrong. Perhaps illness, perhaps sorcery. People read chimneys like signs, gauging the health of their community by how the smoke rose and whether it carried the smell of stew or strange herbs. Of course, every so often chimneys really did present danger. Birds nested, sparks caused fires, and collapsing masonry blocked flues. These genuine threats only fueled belief in their supernatural danger. A house fire wasn't poor construction, it was the devil slipping in. A chimney collapse wasn't bad luck, it was punishment for neglected prayers. By translating structural faults into cosmic judgment, villagers could explain disaster in a way that made sense to them. Because what's scarier? Crumbling mortar, or demons making themselves at home? And so, the medieval chimney became more than architecture. It was a hole to heaven, a tunnel to hell, and a gossipy little throat that whispered omens with every draught of wind. Families guarded it, priests blessed it, and storytellers filled it with terrors. And while we laugh today, imagine yourself in that cottage, wind shrieking, shadows flickering on the wall, and the chimney groaning like something alive. Wouldn't you wonder, just a little, if someone, or something, was on its way down? The medieval winter solstice was less about cosmic wonder and more about desperately trying not to get eaten by spirits, cursed by witches, or generally annihilated by the long night. Today, we look at the solstice as a charming astronomical event, maybe an excuse to post a picture of Stonehenge at sunrise and pretend we're deeply spiritual. But for a medieval villager, the solstice was the ultimate brace-yourself moment of the year. The longest night wasn't a marvel, it was a threat, a darkness so thick that surely something must crawl through it. You, sitting by the fire now, might think, how dramatic. but put yourself in a drafty hut with wolves howling outside, your candle stub sputtering out, and old Auntie Geetha muttering that tonight the dead walk. You'd be dramatic too. The solstice represented imbalance. The sun had retreated, light surrendered, and the world seemed tilted toward doom. Villagers often explained winter by saying the sun was sick, wounded, or even captured by dark forces. On solstice night, they feared it might never return. Can you imagine waking up every year thinking, well, maybe this time daylight won't come back? The nervous glances, the suspicious stares at the horizon, it's a wonder anyone got sleep at all. And when dawn finally arrived, villagers sighed in relief like exam takers who just scraped a pass. The sun was back, barely, but alive. Until then, everyone behaved as though the world balanced on a knife edge, and one misplaced word could send it plunging into eternal night. Because of this cosmic anxiety, people clung to rituals. You couldn't just trust the sun to return on its own. You had to help it along with noise, fire, or food offerings. One common practice was banging pots and pans outside the house, not to chase away foxes or burglars, but to frighten back the encroaching dark. Imagine an entire village clattering like an out-of-tune orchestra at midnight, children whacking ladles on cauldrons while dogs barked in confusion. The racket wasn't for fun, it was survival. Darkness was an enemy army, and noise was the only weapon peasants had. To modern ears, it sounds like a drunk festival. To them, it was deadly serious. Then came the fires. Bonfires weren't just for warmth. They were cosmic lighthouses, signals to the sun that people were still waiting. Some believed flames literally fed the sun, like throwing it a midnight snack so it had energy to rise again. Families piled logs as high as they could manage, sometimes setting whole fields ablaze in their panic. It wasn't wasteful, it was insurance. Better to burn your firewood than wake to an eternal night. If sparks flew upward, villagers took it as a sign the message had been received. If the fire smoked too much or fizzled, panic spread. Someone had offended the dark. Quick, more logs, more prayers, more frantic muttering about demons at the door. Food played a role too. At solstice feasts, the point wasn't indulgence alone, it was appeasement. Spirits roaming on the longest night needed snacks. Bread crusts were left on windowsills, bowls of porridge set by the door, ale poured into the earth. Better to feed the dead than have them feed on us, villagers would say, with the sort of grim humour you develop when starvation is a genuine possibility. Children were told to mind their manners at the feast because rude behaviour could anger invisible guests. A dropped spoon wasn't clumsiness, it was an insult to whatever ghost was lurking under the table. So yes, manners mattered. You didn't want to be the reason an ancestor dragged everyone into misfortune. The solstice also carried fears of shapeshifters. Wolves, already terrifying enough, were believed to grow stronger on this night. Their howls weren't just hunger, they were hymns to the darkness, prayers to keep the sun away. If you heard a wolf too close, you weren't supposed to speak its name aloud, lest it understood and came for you. Cats, owls, even bats were suspected of carrying messages for witches. Families sometimes locked their animals inside, partly for safety, partly because who knew what side the creatures were on. If the rooster didn't crow at dawn, was it because the sun had died, or because the rooster had secretly joined the enemy? Speaking of witches, the solstice was considered their busiest workday. With so much darkness to cover their deeds, they could curse villages, spoil milk, or dance with demons all night long. People carried charms into bed, iron nails placed under pillows, sprigs of evergreen hung above doors. Some even sat awake in shifts, one group keeping watch while others slept. Falling asleep on the solstice wasn't laziness, it was practically treason. You had to guard your family, your hearth, and possibly the entire sun. No pressure. The church, of course, tried to redirect all this panic into holy channels. Priests organized vigils, ringing bells at midnight to remind everyone that God, not demons, controlled the seasons. But villagers weren't always convinced. Bells were nice, sure, but they also knew old widow Maud down the lane had been seen muttering at her chickens again, and honestly, maybe she was the reason smoke wouldn't rise right. Church or no church, you didn't risk ignoring the old folk tales. People hedged their bets, praying in the chapel by day and scattering salt at their doorstep by night. Another delightful superstition said that on solstice night, animals could speak. Sounds charming, doesn't it? Until you realize villagers weren't imagining cute conversations with cows about the weather. No, they feared animals would blurt out terrible secrets, like predicting death or revealing who in the village was cursed. A farmer catching his ox whispering doom at midnight would not wake up cheerful. Some families even avoided their barns entirely, too frightened to overhear their pig announcing, "By the way, your cousin won't see spring." That's the kind of prophecy you didn't want at bedtime. And then there was the fear of time itself unraveling. On the solstice, with the world teetering in darkness, the boundary between years grew thin. Some believed the past could creep back in, that old wrongs and forgotten enemies returned as phantoms. Others whispered that the future bled into the present, with visions of coming famine or plague appearing in dreams. Sleep was risky, but so was staying awake. Either way, you might glimpse too much. It made for a restless night, households torn between exhaustion and terror, dozing fitfully while shadows lengthened on the walls. Yet, amid all this fear, there was laughter. Human beings cannot stay terrified forever. Once the pots had been banged, the fire built, the food shared, and the charms laid out, people leaned into the absurdity. They joked about ghosts stealing their stew, or wolves holding midnight church services in the forest. They teased children who peeked too eagerly up the chimney. Humor became armor. If you could laugh at the darkness, you made it smaller, even if only for a moment. And perhaps that was the secret. Not the rituals, not the charms, but the shared belief that surviving the night together meant something. By dawn, the relief was almost ecstatic. A faint line of gold on the horizon proved the sun still lived. Villagers cheered, hugged, wept, and sometimes immediately collapsed into bed. They told stories of what they'd heard or seen, exaggerating details until last night's terror became today's entertainment. Did you hear the ox predict the miller's baldness? Did you see the sparks dance like devils? Out of fear, folklore was born, and out of folklore, tradition. Each solstice added another layer to the communal memory, another tale to whisper on cold nights. So when we think of medieval solstice fears, let's not imagine grim silence and shivering despair. Picture instead a village clanging with pots, fires roaring, children wide-eyed with dread and delight, and old grandmothers shaking their heads knowingly, as if they'd personally negotiated with the sun. It was fear, yes, but it was also festivity. A night where cosmic terror met community theatre. And perhaps, in their noisy, smoky, nervous way, medieval villagers were doing the same thing we do when we light candles, throw parties, or count down to midnight, trying to remind ourselves that no matter how long the night, the light always comes back, eventually. The medieval imagination did not take kindly to animals in winter. Beasts in summer could be tolerated, cows grazing lazily, horses plodding along, dogs chasing after scraps. But once the cold set in, animals became suspicious. They were no longer just creatures to milk, shear, or occasionally roast. They were potential omens, conspirators with witches, or downright monsters wearing fur. The long nights of midwinter bred stories as fast as rabbits, and naturally, many of these tales involved beasts behaving very badly indeed. If you've ever stared into the glowing eyes of a cat on a December night and thought, "That thing knows too much," congratulations, you share the instincts of a medieval villager. Wolves, of course, stole the starring role in this bestiary of terror. Midwinter was their season. Hunger drove them close to villages, and their howls echoed through the frozen trees like eerie sermons to the dark. Peasants swore wolves grew bolder and stranger during the solstice weeks. Some claimed packs walked upright like men, holding counsel under the moon. Others said wolves could speak on Christmas Eve, though what they had to say was rarely good news. A growl outside your door might as well have been the devil knocking. Practical farmers muttered about livestock safety, but neighbours were more likely to whisper that the wolves were agents of darkness, here to test humanity's resolve. Throw a log on the fire, pray harder, and for heaven's sake don't whistle, because whistling was practically sending them an invitation. Dogs didn't escape suspicion either. Loyal by day, they were thought to wander mysteriously at night, joining ghostly hunts or leading spirits into the yard. A dog howling in midwinter wasn't just a nuisance, it was a cosmic alarm bell. Someone in the village was doomed. If it howled 3 times, you might as well start digging a grave. Some families locked their dogs indoors, not to protect them, but to stop them from chatting with passing demons. You see, the assumption wasn't that dogs misbehaved, it was that dark forces bribed them. Medieval villagers were very pragmatic about corruption. If humans could be tempted, so could hounds. Cats, meanwhile, were practically furry demons in people's eyes. Winter made them even more sinister, for their glowing eyes were visible longer in the dim light. Tales abounded of the Yule cat, a monstrous feline said to stalk the countryside, devouring anyone who hadn't received new clothes by Christmas. Yes, you heard that correctly. Wear your fresh socks or be eaten alive. Parents wielded this threat with glee, turning a giant supernatural cat into the ultimate excuse for laundry-based discipline. Even ordinary house cats drew suspicion. If one sat staring at the fire too intently, villagers wondered if it was plotting with witches. If it darted suddenly across the threshold, it wasn't chasing a mouse. It was warding off or inviting in spirits, depending on who you asked. Either way, the cat was up to no good. Then came the livestock, supposedly harmless but often recruited into the world of omens. Cows were said to kneel in their stalls on Christmas Eve, honouring the Christ child. If you happened to spy them doing it, congratulations, you'd be blessed. But if you overheard them speaking while they knelt, run for the hills, because cattle voices meant death. Horses, too, weren't entirely trustworthy. Strong and necessary though they were, villagers suspected they sometimes carried witches to Sabbaths under the cover of darkness. A tired horse in the morning wasn't evidence of overwork. It had clearly been moonlighting as a broomstick. Chickens that refused to lay in winter weren't lazy, they were hexed. And pigs. Pigs snorted at odd times, which was taken as evidence they could smell evil nearby. Really, the barn was less a place of food production and more a paranormal hotspot. Wild beasts carried their own terrors. Boars, for instance, embodied chaos. They were dangerous enough in reality, charging through forests with tusks capable of goring hunters. Add superstition, and suddenly the midwinter boar became an emissary of death, snorting mist in the moonlight like a miniature dragon. Bears, though rarer, were linked to strength and also to slumber. A bear spotted in winter was a terrible omen. Why wasn't it asleep? Clearly, it had risen to join the forces of darkness. Ravens and crows, meanwhile, circled overhead like flying gossip. Their croaks were messages from the other world, and a flock settling on a roof was enough to send a family into frantic prayer. People didn't just shoo them off, they hurled salt and muttered charms. It wasn't bird control, it was exorcism. But the most fascinating of midwinter beasts were the hybrids of folklore, creatures stitched together from fear and imagination. Villagers told stories of black dogs the size of oxen, their eyes glowing like coals, roaming crossroads at night. Spot one, and you'd either die soon or be dragged to hell, depending on the storyteller's mood. Ghostly stags appeared in certain regions, said to be hunted by spectral riders forever. Seeing one meant the wild hunt was near, and you really didn't want to bump into that parade of the damned. Then there were serpents said to sleep beneath frozen lakes, stirring restlessly in the long dark, waiting for cracks in the ice to slither through. You can imagine a fisherman nervously checking every ripple, wondering if his next catch would have horns. The fear of beasts wasn't purely irrational. Winter really did push animals closer to humans, blurring boundaries. A wolf stealing a sheep could be explained as hunger, but why not add a sprinkle of demonology to make it more exciting? When a fox snuck into a hen house, was it just hunting, or was it an imp wearing a fox's skin? This mixing of reality and superstition gave people both a sense of control and a good story to tell around the fire. After all, the cow died of illness is dreary. The cow was cursed after refusing to kneel properly on Christmas Eve is much better entertainment. Naturally, villagers tried to protect themselves with animal-focused rituals. Horses had charms braided into their manes, pigs were blessed before slaughter, and cats were occasionally bribed with scraps to keep them on the family's side. Evergreens were hung in barns, not just to cheer the livestock, but to ward off spectral visitors. A farmer might whisper prayers into a cow's ear, just in case it overheard something dangerous in the dark. And heaven help the dog that barked 3 times at midnight. Its owner would be dashing to the church for holy water before the echo faded. Humour, as ever, helped people cope. Jokes about the Yule cat's fashion sense, quips about oxen gossiping in the stalls, and stories of pigs snoring loud enough to scare spirits kept the terror at bay. Laughter softened the edge of belief, allowing people to live alongside their imagined beasts without being paralyzed by fear. Children especially thrived on these tales, half believing, half giggling, always wondering if tonight was the night they'd catch the rooster announcing doom. In the end, midwinter beasts weren't just monsters in the dark, they were mirrors of human anxiety. Hungry wolves reflected hunger in human bellies. Speaking cattle echoed the fear of death's approach. Cats embodied mistrust of independence, dogs suspicion of loyalty's limits. Each creature carried the weight of survival, fear, and hope wrapped in fur, feathers, or fangs. So while we laugh today at the idea of cows chatting theology or wolves holding board meetings, remember, for medieval folk, these stories helped make sense of the chaos of winter. Better a world full of talking beasts than a world where the silence of death reigned supreme. So, next time your dog howls in December or your cat stares at the wall like it's watching invisible drama unfold, pause for a moment, laugh if you like, but imagine yourself in a frost-bitten hut, the wind rattling the shutters, shadows twitching in the firelight, and every animal around you suddenly too quiet. Wouldn't you start to wonder if the old tales were true? Wouldn't you fear that, come midwinter, the beasts were watching you just as nervously as you were watching them? The medieval New Year was less champagne and fireworks and more, please dear heavens, don't let the coming year kill us. Today, we clink glasses, mumble half-hearted resolutions about eating more salad, and wake up with headaches. Medieval villagers, on the other hand, spent the turn of the year scanning every creak, sneeze, or spilled drink for hidden meaning. The future wasn't a vague concept. It was lurking just around the corner, waiting to pounce. And the first few hours of the new year were like an exam paper filled with ominous multiple-choice questions. Answer wrong, and you could be signing up for famine, plague, or worse, taxes. For starters, who crossed your threshold first after midnight mattered enormously. A tall, dark-haired man was usually a blessing, but a red-haired visitor could spell doom. Why? Possibly because of lingering Viking trauma. Nothing like centuries of raids to sour you on gingerbeards. Women arriving first were sometimes unlucky too, unless bearing bread, salt, or ale, in which case they were grudgingly tolerated. Villagers called this first footing, and households schemed like generals planning a siege. Imagine shoving your most promising neighbor through the door just after midnight while hissing, "Quick, bring the loaf." Meanwhile, unlucky relatives learned to loiter outside until someone else broke the ice. Noise was another obsession. Just as solstice required clattering pots to scare away darkness, New Year's demanded rowdiness to frighten off misfortune. Children ran through streets banging pans, men blew horns, women shrieked, dogs howled in chorus, and the whole village sounded like an out-of-tune orchestra of chaos. The idea was simple. Start the year so loudly that evil spirits packed up and went somewhere quieter. The neighbors 2 villages over? Let them deal with it. If you thought New Year's Eve fireworks were noisy, imagine trying to sleep through medieval peasants shrieking like banshees while cows mooed in protest. Subtlety was not their strong suit. Food, naturally, carried symbolic weight. Eating something round promised coins in your purse, so pies and loaves were popular. Eating something sticky supposedly bound good luck to you, like honey clinging to your fingers. Avoid poultry though, because chickens scratch backward, and who wants a year that goes in reverse? Fish were better, swimming forward into fortune, though only if you didn't choke on a bone and doom yourself before the calendar had even warmed up. Some families left scraps for spirits, just in case the dead were peckish. Nothing said Happy New Year like leaving porridge out for your grandmother's ghost. Weather on New Year's Day was practically scripture. A bright sunrise meant prosperity, though too bright might mean drought. Snow on the ground was good for crops, unless it melted too quickly, which meant floods. Rain suggested tears, thunder suggested war, and fog suggested witches would have a very busy year. Basically, whatever the weather did, someone declared it an omen, and neighbors nodded gravely. You can picture the arguments. Rain means sorrow. Nonsense, it means abundance. Well, I stubbed my toe in the rain last year, so clearly it means plague. Medieval meteorology was less science and more gossip with conviction. Then there were dreams. The first dream of the year was sacred, a direct telegram from the other world. Dream of gold, riches ahead. Dream of pigs, bad harvest. Dream of kissing the miller's son, either a scandalous romance or indigestion from too much ale. People woke up and immediately recited their dreams to avoid forgetting, then interpreted them with the seriousness of lawyers reading contracts. Even nightmares were valued. A dream of death didn't mean death itself, but transformation. Unless you dreamed of your own shoes burning, which meant actual death. If this sounds confusing, it's because it was. But when your future depends on whether your brain coughed up a vision of cabbage or cabbage worms, you pay attention. New Year's water rituals were another delight. Drawing the first bucket from the well at dawn guaranteed purity and health for the household. Woe betide anyone who spilled it. It meant sickness. Rivers and springs were visited to wash away last year's sins, and some even tossed bread or coins into the current as offerings to water spirits. Imagine explaining to your neighbor that you didn't pay your rent because you flung your last penny into a stream for luck. Better broke than cursed, right? Animals once again played their role. A rooster crowing early meant a busy year ahead, while silence meant laziness or disaster. Cows lowing contentedly promised milk, but restless cows suggested famine. If a cat sneezed, it foretold guests. If a dog barked 3 times in succession, it foretold death. Horses stamping at midnight meant journeys. You didn't need a calendar when you had a barn full of oracles snorting and sneezing their way through destiny. Farmers became reluctant augurs, trying to distinguish between prophetic omens and simple indigestion. One particularly charming superstition declared that whatever you did first in the new year set the tone for the rest of it. Work too hard and you'd toil endlessly. Argue and quarrels would plague you. Spill ale and your year would be a mess. Thus, people carefully staged their actions. Families shared bread at dawn, hugged, exchanged tokens, and tried very hard not to yell at one another. Some refused to touch tools or weapons on New Year's Day, lest they doom themselves to endless labor or war. Others made a point of lending or borrowing small items, ensuring a year filled with generosity and community. Resolutions weren't private vows. They were rituals enacted before witnesses, half promise, half insurance policy. Still, fear lingered. What if you sneezed at the wrong time? What if a stranger crossed your path before your lucky neighbor could? What if the weather refused to cooperate? People hedged their bets with extra charms, salt at the door, iron in the pocket, prayers muttered between sips of ale. Medieval villagers weren't exactly optimistic about the future. They expected hardship and clung to every scrap of reassurance that it might be avoided. If the year turned out terrible, well, clearly someone forgot to bang their pot loudly enough. Yet, as with so many medieval fears, humour softened the blow. People laughed at each other's unlucky omens, teased neighbours for bad dreams, and swapped increasingly exaggerated stories about cows predicting famine. Festivals were as much about laughter as protection. If you can mock the darkness, you can endure it. Perhaps that was the real power of these omens. Not their accuracy, but their ability to draw people together in shared superstition, reminding everyone that survival was a group project. So the medieval New Year wasn't fireworks and champagne, but clattering pans, nervous glances at cats, prayers at wells, and frantic whispering about dreams. It was equal parts terror and theatre, fear wrapped in festivity, and while we might scoff at the idea of poultry dictating destiny or sneezes shaping fate, think about your own rituals. Lucky socks? First song of the year, carefully timed kisses. We're not so different. Humans have always stared at the calendar's turning point and thought, best do something weird just in case. So when midnight strikes and you raise your glass, picture your ancestors banging pots, bribing cats, and begging the weather not to look suspicious. Then thank your lucky stars, literally, that the sun is still shining, the year is still turning, and no ox has just informed you of your impending doom. When you imagine medieval brewing, you probably picture a cozy hearth, monks humming chants, barrels lined up neatly, and villagers patiently waiting for their golden cups of mead and ale. The reality, especially in winter, was more like organized chaos in a freezer. Brewing was always a demanding craft, but when the frost bit into wooden planks and the rivers froze solid, things became particularly dicey. The monks who perfected much of the brewing process had to contend with bitter winds that crept through monastery walls, while villagers brewing in their cottages found their fermentation vessels behaving like moody cats, sometimes producing miraculous batches, and sometimes deciding, without warning, to turn into sour swamp water. Winter brewing, therefore, was less science and more bargaining with nature. The process began with water, which in December or January could be either frozen stiff or so cold it shocked the brewer's hands into numbness within minutes. Wells had to be broken open with iron tools and buckets hauled out while fingers stiffened. Villagers joked that you could tell the quality of the ale by how many toes the brewer lost to frostbite in the process. Once the water was secured, malt was prepared, though sprouting grains was tricky in the damp cold. Too much moisture and they rotted, too little warmth and nothing happened. Some tried keeping grain beds near fires, which worked until sparks leapt into the pile and roasted more than intended. The smell of burned barley became the medieval equivalent of forgetting toast in the morning, except it ruined not breakfast, but the entire village's supply of drink. Mead offered its own challenges. Honey was precious, often guarded more fiercely than gold, and in winter, bees were not exactly out buzzing merrily to top up supplies. Mead brewers scraped jars for every last drop, sometimes even raiding old combs, or melting honey that had crystallized into something resembling stone. Diluting honey with hot water helped, though that meant fetching more water from icy wells, a chore often assigned to unlucky apprentices who grumbled all the way and returned with buckets sloshing over their boots. The honey-water mixture was supposed to ferment into liquid sunshine, but in cold weather, yeast sulked. Yeast is a finicky little creature. It likes warmth, not freezing stone cottages, so brewers wrapped jars in cloth, tucked them near fires, or even shared sleeping quarters with them, muttering encouragement like parents coaxing a stubborn toddler. Of course, contamination was a constant risk. Winter air carried not just crisp snowflakes, but also smoke, soot, and germs, though medieval folk didn't know what germs were. They simply knew that sometimes ale turned sour, or mead tasted like someone had dipped a boot in it. To ward off these invisible foes, they relied on charms. A sprig of evergreen hung above the brewing vat might keep evil spirits away. A whispered prayer to Saint Arnold, patron of brewers, was considered essential. Some even muttered insults at the cauldron to scare away demons lurking inside. Imagine a bearded monk shaking his fist at a bubbling pot, accusing it of treachery, while novices tried not to laugh. Fermentation itself was unpredictable. Too warm and the brew spoiled, too cold and it stalled. Timing mattered enormously, but there were no thermometers, only instincts and experience. One old tale tells of a brewer who judged the readiness of ale by sticking his nose over the vat and counting sneezes. 3 sneezes meant perfection, 2 meant wait longer, 4 meant disaster. Whether this was genuine expertise or a convenient excuse to drink more samples remains unclear. Still, these folk methods often worked surprisingly well. Years of practice honed senses of taste, smell, and sight until brewers could read their vats like fortune tellers read palms. And then there were rats. Oh yes, rats loved breweries. Winter drove them indoors, seeking warmth and nibbling on grain stores with gleeful abandon. Cats were essential members of brewing households, though they sometimes knocked over vessels while chasing their prey. Villagers accepted a certain amount of rodent presence as inevitable. After all, you couldn't post no entry signs for rats. Some even joked that a little rat nibbling added character. Others, less cheerful, set traps or prayed to whatever saint handled vermin problems. Brewing without losing half your supplies to rodents was considered a minor miracle. Storage, too, was tricky. Once brewed, ale and mead had to be kept from freezing, souring, or being stolen by thirsty neighbours. Barrels were stashed in cellars or buried in straw, but leaks were common, especially when wood contracted in the cold. Imagine the heartbreak of discovering that your carefully brewed batch had seeped into the ground overnight. On the other hand, neighbours often followed their noses to the source and staged impromptu tastings, claiming they were simply helping to clean up. Some villages developed traditions of sharing accidental spills, turning disaster into celebration, though the brewer himself rarely appreciated the humour. Despite these obstacles, ale and mead flowed through medieval winters, warming bones and spirits alike. Brewing was a communal act, often involving the whole household. Women were especially vital, managing much of the process and passing down recipes through generations. A family's reputation might rest not on their wealth or land, but on the quality of their ale. Monasteries, meanwhile, became famous for their consistency, with travellers seeking out abbeys renowned for drink that actually tasted the same from one season to the next. This reliability elevated monks from humble servants of God to near celebrities in brewing circles, though their rivals sometimes accused them of secret deals with the divine yeast. It is worth remembering that ale was not a luxury, it was survival. Water could be unsafe, carrying diseases unknown to science but painfully familiar to anyone who drank the wrong stream. Ale, even weak ale, was safer, boiled in the brewing process and preserved by alcohol. Mead carried similar benefits, though its expense meant it appeared less often at the peasant's table. For villagers, brewing was as essential as baking bread, part of the cycle of life. Winter may have frozen rivers and buried fields, but ale offered liquid comfort, a reminder that human ingenuity could coax warmth from the bleakest season. And let us not forget the taste. After trudging through snow, feeding livestock, and shivering in smoke-filled huts, a mug of frothy ale felt like catching a glimpse of summer. Mead, with its golden sweetness, tasted like stolen sunshine, a small miracle in a season of hunger and gloom. The first sip was not just refreshment, but reassurance that life would go on, that winter could be endured. Every barrel that survived freezing, rats, and the brewer's own clumsy hands was a triumph worth celebrating. Thus, medieval winter brewing was a mixture of skill, luck, superstition, and stubborn determination. It was farmers warming their hands over steaming vats, monks whispering prayers into bubbling cauldrons, women scolding apprentices for spilling grain, and neighbours sniffing the air for signs of a feast. It was laughter, curses, songs, and sighs, all bound up in the eternal struggle against cold and hunger. And though the techniques have modernized, something of that old magic still lingers every time we raise a glass against the dark. If you think your grandmother's advice about hot soup curing everything under the sun is amusing, wait until you hear about medieval attitudes toward ale. In those days, ale wasn't just a drink to wash down your dinner or make your neighbor's jokes sound funnier. It was medicine, miracle cure, and sometimes the closest thing people had to a pharmacy. The line between tavern and apothecary was astonishingly thin, and many a sick villager found themselves prescribed a hearty mug of ale by someone who had never read a medical text in their life. Yet in a world where professional doctors were rarer than unicorns and usually just as affordable, people clung to the healing warmth of ale like it was brewed straight from heaven's cauldron. Winter made this belief especially urgent. Cold winds tore through cottages, food was scarce, and bodies weakened from months of hunger and hard labour. Illness lurked in every corner, coughs, fevers, aching joints, and a general sense that life itself was a bit unfair. Physicians, those who actually studied in universities, spoke about humours, those mysterious bodily fluids whose balance supposedly dictated health. Too much phlegm? You were sluggish? Too much black bile? You were melancholy? Too much ale? Well, technically that wasn't in their textbooks, but villagers happily added it to the list. The prescription was obvious, a warm cup of ale to balance out whatever had gone astray. Ale was particularly praised for its supposed power to warm the blood. Medieval people believed the body worked like a little furnace, and in the bitter cold, your inner fire could sputter. Ale, with its hearty warmth and touch of alcohol, was thought to rekindle those flames. You weren't just drinking to quench thirst, you were stoking your very life force. If your hands were numb, ale would fix it. If your nose was frozen, ale would melt it. If your spirit sagged under grey skies, ale would cheer it up. Whether it actually worked or not was irrelevant. What mattered was that people swore by it, and that gave it power. The beauty of ale as medicine was its versatility. Headache? Drink ale. Stomachache? Drink ale, but slower. Toothache? Swish ale around your mouth before swallowing. Insomnia? Ale will put you right to sleep. Too much sleep? Ale will wake you up if it's strong enough. Even childbirth, one of the most terrifying ordeals of the time, often came with a side serving of ale. Women in labour were encouraged to sip it for courage and pain relief, while the midwife might fortify herself with a cup too. After the birth, neighbours gathered with more ale to toast the survival of both mother and child. Somewhere in the back of the room, the village healer was probably muttering about humours, but nobody listened over the sound of mugs clinking. Spiced ale and mead were even more esteemed, almost like medieval versions of cough syrup. Herbs, honey, and warming spices like ginger, cinnamon, or cloves turned a simple drink into a medicinal potion. These concoctions were prescribed for colds, fevers, and general malaise, though let's be honest, they were probably just delicious. Imagine being ill and someone handing you a steaming mug of spiced ale. Suddenly you believe in miracles. Monks brewed versions of these drinks with particular recipes, some guarded like state secrets. A traveller visiting a monastery might emerge healed in both body and soul, or at least convinced that chanting monks knew more than the barber surgeon with his rusty saw down the road. Children weren't excluded either. Today, the idea of giving a child alcohol for a cough would send parents running for the authorities, but in medieval villages, it was perfectly ordinary. Weak ale, also known as small ale, had low alcohol content and was considered safe, even healthier than water, which could harbour disease. A sickly child might be dosed with a spoonful of warmed ale, sometimes with herbs mixed in. The hope was to strengthen their frail bodies and coax them back to life. Whether it worked or not, it at least gave anxious parents the comfort of doing something, and in times when many childhood illnesses were fatal, that comfort mattered. Of course, not all medical uses of ale were swallowed. Some were applied externally. Poultices soaked in ale were pressed onto wounds or swollen joints, with the belief that the healing properties would seep through the skin. Sore eyes might be washed with ale, which sounds like a particularly terrible idea unless you enjoy stinging pain. There are even records of people bathing in ale or rubbing it on their skin, convinced it would banish rashes or boils. The more extravagant claimed that ale kept the complexion rosy, though this may have been more about the blush from drinking it than any real dermatological benefit. Quacks and folk healers leaned into this faith with gusto. Travelling peddlers might sell special brews guaranteed to cure anything from baldness to lovesickness. Villagers, desperate for hope, handed over coins for bottles that were basically ale with a sprig of rosemary floating in it. The placebo effect, combined with the warm buzz of alcohol, probably convinced more than a few customers that they had been healed. Even respected physicians occasionally recommended ale, particularly if mixed with certain herbs. Ale with sage, for instance, was a classic cure for sore throats. Ale with fennel? Good for digestion. Ale with literally anything? Worth a try, apparently. The church, predictably, had mixed feelings about this. On one hand, monasteries brewed and sold ale, fully aware of its reputation as a curative. On the other, they warned against drunkenness, which was considered sinful. The line between healing and indulgence blurred constantly. A monk might hand you a mug for your health, and then frown sternly if you asked for another just in case. Villagers, meanwhile, merrily ignored the sermons and declared that if God made grain and honey, surely he intended them to be used medicinally. It was, in its own way, a theological loophole. And yes, sometimes ale caused more problems than it solved. Overindulgence led to hangovers, falls, fights, and the occasional regrettable marriage proposal. But even these mishaps were rationalized as the price of healing. Better a sore head than a fever, they reasoned. If you got into a tavern brawl, at least you were warm while swinging punches. And if you fell into a snowbank on the way home, well, the ale had prevented you from noticing frostbite until morning. By then, hopefully, another dose of ale would cure it. What strikes us now is not whether ale truly worked as medicine, but how deeply people believed it did. Belief itself was half the cure. In the bleakness of winter, when real remedies were scarce, and hope scarcer still, a steaming mug of ale was more than just liquid. It was reassurance in a cup. To drink was to participate in a ritual of survival, to tell yourself and your neighbours that life could continue. Perhaps that was the real medicine all along. So when the medieval villager sniffled, coughed, or groaned about aching bones, the answer was almost always the same: have some ale. It was simple, comforting, and as much a part of winter as the snow itself. We may laugh now at their faith in barley and honey, but glance at the shelves of modern pharmacies, teas, tonics, cough syrups, herbal concoctions, and tell me we've really changed that much. After all, even today when someone is miserable with a cold, what do we often suggest? A hot drink, some rest, and maybe, just maybe, a little nip of something strong to help them sleep. The medievals would raise a frothy mug in agreement. When winter wrapped the medieval world in icy claws and the fields lay silent beneath snow, there remained one beacon of warmth and joy: the feasting table, groaning under whatever scraps could be gathered, and most importantly, the ever-present mead. Mead was not merely a drink, it was the golden thread weaving through celebrations, lifting spirits, and turning bleak, midwinter nights into memories worth singing about. Picture a drafty hall where the wind howls through the shutters, pigs snort in the straw, and villagers huddle together for warmth. Now imagine someone slamming down a great horn filled with honeyed mead, shouting something cheerful, and suddenly everyone forgets the frost on their toes. That was the true power of this drink. It transformed hardship into merriment, like liquid courage infused with sunshine. Medieval people needed their celebrations, and they didn't do things halfway. A feast without mead or ale was like a knight without armor, technically possible, but likely to end badly. At Yuletide, when darkness seemed eternal and the threat of famine loomed, communities gathered to banish despair with song, dance, and enormous quantities of drink. Mead was the crown jewel of such occasions, especially since honey was precious and hard to come by. To serve mead at a feast declared, "Look, we are rich enough to sweeten our drinks in the dead of winter." That alone was cause for applause, or at least loud slurping noises. The rituals surrounding mead were half practical, half theatre. Drinking horns and wooden cups circulated endlessly, each sip carrying not just flavour, but symbolic weight. When the lord of the manor raised his horn, everyone else followed. Toasts were exchanged with gusto, honouring gods, saints, ancestors, and occasionally the family cow, depending on how many horns had been drained already. Toasting itself was serious business, because sharing drink bound people together. To raise your cup in someone's name was to promise friendship, loyalty, and maybe a favour involving a borrowed ox later. Mead created bonds stronger than parchment contracts, because parchment didn't make you sing bawdy songs at the top of your lungs. And sing they did. Mead was fuel for music, and medieval songs grew steadily more enthusiastic as mugs emptied. At first the tunes were noble and stately, praising lords or recounting heroic deeds. By the fourth or fifth round, however, lyrics wandered into questionable rhymes about sheep and scandalous verses about the miller's daughter. No one minded. The warmth of drink blurred distinctions of class, at least temporarily, and allowed peasants and nobles alike to laugh at the same foolish joke. Mead gave permission to forget hierarchy, to become simply human in the face of winter's cold. Of course, when morning arrived, hierarchies were restored with headaches included, but for a few shining hours, all were equal at the feasting board. Food and drink danced hand in hand at these gatherings. Roasted meats, pies, stews and bread soaked up the honeyed liquid, though inevitably someone miscalculated and ended up snoring loudly by the fire before the pudding appeared. Mead was also used in cooking, enriching sauces or sweetening pastries, further proving that no medieval celebration was complete without it. The scent of mead mingling with roasting goose or simmering pottage created an atmosphere intoxicating long before anyone actually drank. Kitchens bustled, serving girls dodged groping hands with professional skill, and dogs lingered in hope of scraps, all while mead horns clinked like the percussion section of a very chaotic orchestra. Religious feasts too embraced mead, though monks tended to frown if merriment tipped too far into debauchery. At Christmas Mass, for example, villagers might emerge pious and solemn, only to tumble into the great hall afterward, where mugs were already lined up. Saints were toasted alongside kings, and biblical stories retold with increasingly creative details as the mead flowed. One can imagine a slightly tipsy parishioner insisting that Noah's Ark was less about animals and more about storing barrels of honey wine. The line between sacred and profane blurred quickly when warmed by drink, but most communities accepted this as the natural order of things. Marriage celebrations, of course, leaned heavily on mead. The very term honeymoon comes from the tradition of newlyweds drinking honey wine for a full lunar cycle to encourage fertility and harmony. Imagine starting married life by drinking sweet mead every evening for a month, while your parents and in-laws hover approvingly, waiting for signs of a grandchild. Whether it worked scientifically didn't matter. The symbolism was strong enough to convince entire villages that mead and matrimony were inseparable companions. Weddings without mead were whispered about disapprovingly, as if the couple had already doomed themselves to barren fields and bickering. Better to keep honey flowing than risk eternal gossip. Of course, not every mead-fueled festivity was peaceful. Too much drink could spark quarrels, sometimes escalating into brawls that overturned tables and spilled precious wine onto rush-covered floors. Tavern keepers groaned, lords scolded, and monks prayed, but year after year the pattern repeated. Mead loosened tongues and tempers as easily as it loosened belts, and winter nights often ended with someone nursing both a hangover and a black eye. Yet these mishaps were accepted with a shrug. A feast without at least one dramatic quarrel was considered strangely unsatisfying, like a play without its climax. The following day, apologies were mumbled, debts were settled, and life resumed with another story to laugh about. Children, though rarely allowed to drink strong mead, still absorbed the festive atmosphere. They darted between benches, snatching scraps, giggling at drunken uncles, and memorizing songs they were technically too young to know. For them, the sight of glowing candles, golden cups, and the endless roar of laughter became lifelong memories. Mead represented more than taste. It embodied community, continuity, and the reminder that even in the darkest months, joy was possible. Later, those same children would brew their own honey wine, continuing traditions that outlasted generations. Perhaps the most striking feature of mead in feasts was how it symbolized hope. Winter was a fearful time when death felt close at hand and survival was never guaranteed. To gather together, raise a cup, and sing loudly into the night was a defiant gesture, a collective roar against despair. Mead became the medium of that defiance, carrying the sweetness of summer's bees into the heart of winter's chill. Every sip was a reminder that warmth and abundance could return, that life's hardships could be softened, at least for an evening, with friendship and honey. Even today, when mead appears at Renaissance fairs or in the hands of hobbyist brewers, it carries that aura of festivity. The taste is different from ale or wine. It is older, stranger, almost mythical, as if you can feel the shadow of those medieval halls where laughter rang against timbered roofs. Drink it, and you too are transported to a world where winter's cold is kept at bay, not by central heating but by golden liquid, roaring fires, and the unshakable determination to celebrate life while it lasts. That, after all, was the true heart of medieval festivity, not wealth or splendor, but resilience made joyful through shared cups of mead. If you've ever walked into a modern pub and overheard gossip so juicy you nearly spit out your drink, congratulations. You've experienced a fragment of medieval life, because the alehouse of old wasn't just a place to drink. It was the medieval version of Twitter, the village courthouse, the theatre, the dating app, and sometimes the boxing ring, all wrapped into one smoky, noisy, wonderfully chaotic building. Imagine a low-ceilinged room smelling of malt, sweat, and wet straw, packed with villagers hunched over mugs of ale. Someone's singing, someone else is cheating at dice, and in the corner, two farmers are debating which neighbour's goat is secretly possessed by the devil. That was the medieval alehouse in full swing. The gossip alone could power the entire kingdom. Villagers with frozen fields and aching backs had few entertainments besides talking about each other, and the alehouse was the perfect stage. News travelled faster on a wave of frothy mugs than by official messengers. Who stole the miller's chickens? Who was spotted sneaking into the barn after dark? Whose cow gave suspiciously sour milk? Within hours, the whole room would know, and by morning, half of it would be exaggerated beyond recognition. A simple remark like, "I saw Thomas walking with Margaret," could, by the third retelling, become, "Thomas and Margaret eloped under the full moon and offended 3 saints." If medieval villagers had invented hashtags, they would all have been about goats, ale, or adultery. Of course, gossip wasn't just for amusement. It was also politics. The alehouse doubled as a debating chamber where disputes were argued with slurred logic and settled with questionable handshakes. Local quarrels often found their climax here, lubricated by strong drink and an audience eager for drama. Did the blacksmith overcharge for a horseshoe? Did the reeve miscount the grain tithe? Bring it to the alehouse, where opinions flowed as freely as the ale. Sometimes disputes ended with laughter and another round, other times with fists flying and someone landing in the straw outside. Either way, the community left satisfied, having witnessed both entertainment and judgment without bothering the local lord. Then there were the games, which ranged from innocent diversions to schemes that made gamblers today look like saints. Dice games were favourites, simple to play and devilishly addictive. Alehouse tables echoed with the clatter of bone dice as peasants bet anything from pennies to chickens. Card games came later, but before that, people invented endless variations of chance and skill involving knucklebones, stones, or even the arrangement of spilled ale on a table. Cheating was rampant, naturally, and arguments erupted over whether someone had hidden a loaded die or invented rules mid-game. The more ale consumed, the more creative the accusations became, until someone inevitably declared that the devil himself had interfered. Not all games were about gambling. Many involved physical prowess. Arm wrestling across sticky tables was common, as was who can hold their ale the longest without falling over. Singing competitions tested lungs and memory, while dancing contests occasionally broke out in the cramped space, much to the annoyance of whoever's mug got kicked over. Some alehouses even hosted mock trials, where villagers put each other on trial for silly offences, such as stealing pies or singing off-key. The punishment was usually buying another round, which ensured the game never ran out of participants. Alehouses also served as matchmakers, for better or worse. Young men hoping to impress might attempt to outdrink each other, which rarely ended with the desired effect of wooing anyone, unless falling face first into a barrel was considered charming. Women, meanwhile, gathered news and weighed suitors with sharp eyes. Many marriages began with awkward exchanges in the alehouse, though just as many scandals did too. If you wanted to know who fancied whom, all you had to do was linger by the fire with your mug and listen carefully. By the end of the night, the entire village knew anyway. Music was inseparable from alehouse life. Minstrels earned coins by playing lutes, fiddles, or bagpipes, filling the smoky air with tunes that encouraged singing, clapping, and stomping feet. Even without musicians, villagers invented rhythms by pounding tables or banging mugs. Songs ranged from solemn ballads to bawdy verses that would make a priest faint. The alehouse was where creativity flourished. Poems were improvised, riddles exchanged, and insults turned into art forms. A good insult could win more applause than a song, especially if it made the victim laugh too. It was stand-up comedy before microphones, and the ale gave everyone the courage to try. Alehouse keepers had the unenviable task of managing all this chaos. Part host, part referee, part bouncer, they kept the ale flowing while ensuring no one burned the place down. Too little ale and customers grumbled, too much, and the room descended into mayhem. Some innkeepers were shrewd, listening to gossip and spreading it strategically to keep customers entertained. Others just tried to survive the night without broken furniture. The church wagged its finger at alehouses, blaming them for moral decline, but even priests were known to drop in for just one cup when no one was watching. Hypocrisy, too, tasted better with ale. Superstition clung to alehouse life as well. Spilling ale was considered unlucky unless you did it deliberately to toast the spirits, in which case it was generous. Strange noises in the rafters were blamed on mischievous fairies who apparently enjoyed eavesdropping. Dice that rolled too well were suspected of demonic influence, and anyone winning too often risked accusations of witchcraft. The alehouse thus became a theatre of belief, where fate and chance mingled with barley and honey, and villagers explained their fortunes by pointing to forces greater than themselves, conveniently forgetting how many mugs they had already emptied. Winter made the alehouse especially vital. When fields lay buried under snow and outdoor work slowed, villagers needed a place to gather, thaw their fingers, and keep their spirits from collapsing under endless nights. The alehouse glowed like a beacon, promising warmth, laughter, and distraction from hunger and cold. For many, it was less about drink and more about community. Without it, gossip would wither, quarrels would fester, and joy would be harder to find. The alehouse was the village's living room, courtroom, concert hall, and circus tent rolled into one. Looking back, it's tempting to laugh at how much of life revolved around these smoky dens. But then again, consider modern pubs, coffee shops, or even online forums. People still gather to share news, argue, joke, gamble, flirt, and sing badly in public. Our settings may have changed, but the impulse is the same. The medieval alehouse simply gave it flavour, literally, with foamy mugs and sticky tables. If you had walked into one on a winter evening, you would have seen humanity in all its messy, noisy glory, proving once again that survival wasn't just about food and shelter, it was also about stories, laughter, games, and the warm comfort of a drink in hand, while someone whispered the latest scandal about Margaret and her mysterious goat.